Thank you so much for coming, so much.
Thanks, Mara. Thanks so much for this. I think I'm very excited to be here to really, be able to participate. Actually, in the festival itself, I was able to attend a few sessions, and I think I just feel so lucky, so fortunate to be in such amazing company of people who are trying to question education itself. So thank you for having me to begin with. Hello, everybody. I will keep this a very short, quick introduction and then just deep dive into the session. I'm Megha. I am right now speaking to all of you from Bangalore in India. And I work with a very interesting project organization called Project DEFY. We're based out of India. We're headquartered out of India. And one of the things that we've been trying to do over the last, I would say, 6 to 7 years is get to the bottom of that one question around which the session is organized, which is, whose education is it anyway? Project DEFY is trying to come up with answers to this critical question by its own experiment and by setting up design learning spaces, self-designed learning spaces across the globe. I'm one of the two people who's been with the organization right from the beginning, having co-founded this with an incredible, passionate co-founder, Abhijit, who you'll get to hear to along the day. So that's about me. And just a quick insight into what this talk or session is going to be like and what are we going to do here. So I'm going to be looking at this question that I have posed of whose education is it anyway for the next 20 minutes and really come at it from what seems to be happening and what seems to be the primary thesis behind this and what is it that we're seeing change. And then the last 10 minutes, I would really love it if we can have some inquiries, if we can have an open house, we can have questions, and we can hear from each other in line of who do we think this education belongs to anyway, that we keep talking about. So half an hour, and I'm hoping we keep it interesting, we keep it really, really engaging. At any point you have a question, please drop it on the chat box, and we can take it from there in the last 10 minutes. So that's about the session that we're going to deep dive into. So I think just like everybody else who is here today or has really looked at education, I myself came from a very standard education model, and I myself came from the whole lens of the regular standard education system that exists today. Here in India, especially, we do have the erstwhile legacy education system that got passed down to us. So for me personally, I went through what is known as the epitome of standardized education system, which was really to say that we would love for people to really go through standard curriculum, to go through standardized processes, and to become future ready. So looking at that as the primary thesis of what education is, then the question really that comes up is that who is this education trying to prepare people for? And what is it that seems like the end goal of the education that we all think we're going through? And interestingly, if we really look at how education evolved, how education really came up to be, it seems to answer just one question, which is to make market-ready people, which is to really say that the end or the goal of education is not about the person who's going through it, is not about the individual who's going through it, it's not about the child who's going through it, but it is about the market, or it is about the industry, or it is about the world out there that this individual will go in and fit into and has to fit into them. I interestingly had this question right from very early on. And what I saw was that the system doesn't necessarily care about anybody, does not necessarily care about me back then when I was in school, simply because it wasn't necessarily built to look at an individual from the lens of being an individual, but was supposed to look at the individual in terms of what is it that they can fulfill for the larger society. If that seems to be the next pivotal point of what education is supposed to do, then let's look at two things. One, how does an individual fulfill its larger mandate in society? And two, what is it that society then seems to be filling up for this individual herself? Education, as we know it today, does two things primarily. One, it does not look at anybody from the lens of what is it that they really want to be doing, which helps in identifying and which helps in really putting the context on what they can fulfill for the society. And two, it does not necessarily even look at the community or look at the society around the individual to look at what the society could be doing for them so that they become more powerful, so that they become actually more self-conscious of their role in society. Examples of education systems across the globe will give us insights into how societies have tried to do this differently. In India, for example, the historical narrative of education before India was colonized and before our education system was created from grounds up, the history of it is usually associated with what is known as the Gurukul system, what is known as the system where every child went through different phases of learning, and those phases of learning were really geared up for her to go through different life stages. The Gurukul system also played an important role in putting the impetus on the individual herself. While it did that, while it tried to get her to be ready to go through different stages of society, what it missed out on, it definitely missed out on one big question, which was that what is it that you want this individual to be prepared for? What are the constructs for which we want this individual to be prepared for? And somewhere that system also was necessarily only preparing the individual to be ready for what it assumed would be its role in society, which meant that typically boys in the Gurukul system were being prepared to take care of the families they were going to bring up, which means that the access to learning, that the access to specific skill sets were open to young boys. Girls, on the other hand, were being prepared for the pivotal role of nurturing, of becoming mothers, of becoming home takers. And therefore, their training was limited and was made accessible only to those roles. Today, in India, for example, we do look back and we talk about how the Gurukul system really was a better system to go back to. What we miss out on is, again, the question that what was that system really answering for? Was it really answering for the child or the young person who was going through the system? Or was it necessarily answering for, again, the market of household, the market of homes, the market of child rearing? What was it really answering for? The colonized, post-colonized system of education that we see today answers the same question in a different way. The industries, the corporate world, the world where we are badgering young children, where we are asking young people to pick up skills as early as the age of 4, 5, which seem to be relevant for the industry. Today, we see a shift. Today, we see the industry asking for expertise, the industry saying that we want younger and younger people to pick up skills like coding, skills like AI skills like early science, simply because they seem to be the skills of the future, simply because they seem to be the need of, again, the corporate world, the market itself. In this whole play of things, what is the one thing that we forget or we completely overlook? What we forget at the core of this is the choice, is the fact that the individual, the young child, the young person is no more at the center of this. We forget that it does not matter that what is it that excites, that the person is curious about, that the young person is super curious about. And what we focus on is making them another plug in the whole machine that we call capitalism. Data actually is on this side of the story. We see more and more research data that is throwing up the fact that more young people, especially young adults, are today unemployed, are today finishing with graduate degrees, but do not find themselves relevant jobs, relevant employment. They do not seem to be fitting into whatever the roles exist today. Delinquency is on a higher side. We see more first-time university goers families shift more into poverty and move into poverty. We're seeing also more gender biases come in, while there is more push towards getting more girls to go to education systems, to enter the system from the lens of access to learning. But what we still see is higher dropout rates. What we are still seeing is girls not necessarily striving towards roles that are still gender dictated. Now, this should tell us, interestingly, that we're not yet geared to answering for the people. What we are doing necessarily is still running with the system, dictating it from the lens of not the child, not the young learner, but from the lens of where do they fit in. Now, how do we think that people who are not necessarily making choices, people who do not even know in the larger realm of things, what is it that they're passionate about? How do we necessarily think that they're going to be able to build solutions, to build and to problem solve for the world at large? This we see being thrown up when we deal with things like currently climate change, with things like the society in which inequity and inequitable systems exist. And then we ask ourselves that how is it that young people are not answering for it? There's some things that we've seen with the work we do that where we see this actually throw up on our face. So interestingly, in the learning spaces that we run, one of the questions that gets thrown up to us necessarily is that, how is it that even in very radical learning spaces, you don't necessarily see a shift in gender lens on things that people are learning, right? How is it that we don't immediately see that boys are learning typically girls' skill sets like dancing, or we don't see girls really shift to something else? What we miss out there really is, again, the fundamental aspect of choice. How is it that girls who don't necessarily, especially when they come from marginalized communities, who don't necessarily have a choice to even explore their passion, for them to be able to, for the first time, explore the whole euphoria that comes from being able to dance, is a choice that an individual is necessarily making. And therefore, for that individual, her tomorrow, when she has to take a decision for herself, her family, it will come from a place of choice that she has made. That is the critical shift that we are looking at. Education today, as we know it, is also striving towards more inequity, is also striving towards what we are seeing as more divided systems. And this is primarily because the fundamental thesis is that children are stupid and that children need a lot of overseeing. that they need teachers, that they need facilitators. They need to be told what is good for them, what is bad for them. This is fundamentally built into our ways of teaching, our ways of educating. In some countries where education experiments are taking place, where we are seeing a lot of scope for really exploring what child-centered systems look like. But in other countries, what we are seeing is still a control from the lens of policy, from the lens of the ecosystem itself, where there is still a push for keeping the child under control. This also comes from the fundamental belief that young people have to be molded, have to be pretty much standardized and made into certain kind of individuals. What we're seeing here, at least in the context of India, is that while policy is shifting towards saying, give more spaces to allow a child to explore, to be curious, it still is working from the place of allowing them to do it. There is larger emphasis on the scope of intervention continuing to be as teachers, not as community, not as a community of learners, but a top-down model of teacher-led control. This makes me wonder most days that who do we think we are creating these systems for? In my experience of now having worked with young people for quite some time now, what I see is that young people actually have a lot more curiosity and a lot more inquiry in terms of where do they fit into society than we adults do. Killing curiosity, killing the scope of imagining a different scenario for yourself helps to do two things. One, it kills actually the scope to ask questions. And two, it kills, absolutely kills, the scope of adults who will go on and think differently. This works, actually this works. And we're seeing that at least in our context. This works especially when you do not want to really reimagine society around you. Two, it definitely works when you are working towards fulfilling a market-led agenda. We're seeing high number of people, especially after COVID, who've gone back to question in terms of how much do people care about them? How much do their jobs care about them? How much do their companies care about them? And this goes back to asking, where is it that we failed in terms of the education that they went through? Whose education is it anyways? Is it the child's? Is it the parents? Is it the teachers? Or is it a future employer's education that we try to provide to the children, to the students? While we ask this question, one of the most fundamental things that comes up, at least to us, is that if you allow people to have choices, where do we think that they will play a role? Because then what we're looking at is a very scattered system. We're not seeing any kind of cohesion. We're not seeing any kind of a common template running through their choices. And to this, I think what we have to sit back and question is, why do we still imagine a world which is standardized? Why do we still imagine a world which is constantly asking us to really put people in buckets? The moment we take that lens away, we go back to really answering that people who can make choices actually make choices that are better for them, better for their family, better for society at large. And there is actually evidence for this. There is huge evidence for it in experiments that have taken place, in learning spaces that are giving these choices back into the hands of people. We work with a lot of young people who, when they are given the choice to decide what they want to be learning, they actually start thinking of what is the impact they can make in the communities that they're living in. From thinking of how do they manage the waste better, to thinking of how do they get their mothers to become women who can go out and earn a living, to really thinking what is it that they want to do after they finish high school. These become individuals who start thinking of society more than themselves. So there is evidence that children at young age, when really given the free hand and given the fundamental right to choose, go on to become adults that think more empathetically, that think more for communities around them, that think for friends that are around them, and don't just place themselves at the center of it. What we're trying to do is really learn from other people, is really look at other learning spaces models, and to really look at, can we have a global community of self-designed learners who created their own education, actually, who have actually decided that for 3 months or 4 months, this is what they're interested in learning about, this is what they're excited to learn about, and then move on to another thing that they're passionate about. Can they come together and start actually changing the way that society around them functions? We've been asked very often that, do we create isolated islands of happiness? You know, a space where people get to choose, but then they have to go back and fit into the same regular society. To that, I believe, honestly, that if you are able to build these little islands across the world in close vicinity to each other, then imagine what these islands would do when they come together. Imagine in close vicinities, what do people who fundamentally are bringing happiness to themselves, are bringing choices to the people around them, what would they do to change the thesis of how their communities work? Education, as you and I know it, does need an overhaul, and we all know that. We all know that the education as we know it today is not necessarily fulfilling anyone's passion, is not fulfilling anyone's calling, and needs to be completely changed. The bigger question to ask is, are we ready to really place the learner at the center of it? And are we ready to then radically change the way our systems, our spaces, our institutions answer for it? Or will small experiments continue to remain small experiments? And will we become a small group of radical educators globally that are trying to change it, but are not necessarily shifting bigger things? Policy needs to answer for this. Currently, we're going through a radical change in policy in India. We are sitting at a national education policy currently, which is again going back to saying that children are stupid and that children need to be controlled. And the work towards providing self-determination to young people and to young children is what we're trying to shift in our context here in the country and in what we are doing here in the country. And we're hoping that with more and more experiments, with aggregating these experiments, we're able to put the child at the center of the learning and the child at the center of everything that happens for them. At this point, I will stop and I will really take a pause and open this up for discussion and really see if there are thoughts, there are questions here that I can take, but more importantly, thoughts on answering for who's at the center of that education and whose learning is it anyway.
Can I? Megha, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And it was very inspiring. Like, you got me rolling. I have no questions. I just want to say thank you very much.
Thanks, Naro. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm also very inspired, Megha. I think you kind of overbridged how it used to be before, what it is now. You touched upon a number of things that are really, I think, international, not only in India, the segregation, the choices. So it's really amazing. And I think it's interesting you talked about autonomy, because choice actually can be translated to when can we become autonomous. And interesting, I was listening to you and I said like, wow, I would be talking about autonomy. So it's kind of, it's very, very connected what you are talking about, but I will be giving some evidence to that. So you're very much in line with everything. Just a comment.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you. All right, I think we don't necessarily have comments, but I would really implore everyone, to, I know we have Summerhill's social media channels up there. It'll be interesting for all of you to, use the hashtag and really give us one line on what do you think education belongs to? Who do you really think education belongs to? It would actually, I believe, throw up for us in terms of who do we really still think it should belong to, right? So for everybody who's here, we would love to read it. I would love to read it if you use all the hashtags of the conference, tag us also, Project DEFY, so we can actually engage with you to say, what is it that we're seeing globally in terms of who do we think this education really belongs to? So I would probably leave it at that, to say that, let's look at how we've seen it, how we've grown up with it, what lens we put on it, and get you to put it out there and tell us, who do you think this education system really belongs to everywhere, wherever you're from. And get that rolling. We would love to see that. I'm following all the hashtags. I would love to see some of that. And feel free to tag us, Project DEFY, so we can also engage with you.
Thank you so very, very much. It was very inspiring. Thank you for participating and taking the time. It was great.